He thought the storm had taken everything from him, Dot. But when the ground split open on his farm, he dared to climb down Dot. What was hidden at the bottom of the massive sinkhole changed his life and saved the entire valley. Dot, subscribe to the channel and comment which country you're watching from. The alarm clock had long since stopped ringing in Mark Hudson's life. He woke instead by habit, by a body conditioned through generations to rise before the sun. It was still dark when he opened his eyes, the familiar creak of his old farmhouse answering the shift of his weight on the mattress. He lay still for a moment, staring into the shadows that stretched across the ceiling. In the silence, he could hear his own breath, steady but weighted, as though another long day hung over him like a boulder suspended by a fraying rope. Nothing in this house was light anymore. Not the air, not the work, not the thoughts that came when he sat too long in quiet. He pushed himself up, joints stiff and muscles protesting, and reached for the switch of a small lamp on the bedside table. The bulb flickered twice before settling into a dim glow that barely reached the corners of the room. It didn't matter. Mark knew every inch of this place. He had grown up here, a barefoot boy running through these halls while the scent of his mother's cornbread filled the air and his father's deep laugh echoed against the wooden walls. Now the floorboards groaned under him like tired bones, and no one laughed anymore. The house had aged with him, or perhaps ahead of him, as if it bore the weight of his struggles and weariness more quickly than he did. He dressed with the same efficiency of a soldier preparing for duty. Worn jeans, work shirt faded from years of sunlight, boots that were once brown now coated in the dust of failing soil. In the kitchen he brewed a cup of coffee. Black, bitter, the cheapest grounds he could still afford. Sugar was a luxury reserved for better years. He stood by the window while he drank, leaning a hand on the chipped counter as he looked into the fading dark outside. The sky had not yet decided whether it would bring sun or disappointment. Lately, the two meant the same thing. Fields stretched far beyond the yard, or rather what used to be fields. The earth had cracked long ago, splitting into jagged pieces like broken pottery. Grass, once thick and green, existed only in the stubborn patches that clung to life where shade or luck allowed. Most of the ground was bare, beaten by heat and stripped of its promise. The barns and fences stood as ragged skeletons of better times. Even the birds had found reason to leave. Mark stepped out onto the porch, the screen door squealing behind him. The morning air carried a faint chill, but even that felt fragile, sure to fade the moment the sun climbed high. He scanned the horizon automatically, searching for any sign that today might be different. There was nothing except the emptiness of a land that had forgotten how to give. He walked toward the tractor parked near the edge of the property. Its bright green paint had dulled into a faded husk of its former self. Mark ran his hand along the hood, feeling the dents and rust beneath his palm, like scars that told too long a story. He remembered his father holding him steady on this same tractor when Mark was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. The machine had been a symbol of pride then. Now it was another item on a growing list of things he couldn't afford to repair. There was work to do, even when the work yielded nothing. He drove the tractor slowly across a patch of field where corn struggled to rise. The wheels kicked up dry dust that floated lazily in the air before settling right back down like resignation. He planted new seeds when he could afford them, but even the seeds were beginning to feel like prayers sent into silence. Every pass of the machine reminded him he was pouring sweat into a sponge that refused to hold water. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last hints of morning coolness. Sweat soaked through Mark's shirt. His hands ached around the wheel. The fuel gauge dipped lower. When he reached the end of the row, he cut the engine and let the silence roll over him like a tide. The farmland stretched ahead, wide and barren. He saw every failure laid out before him in cracked straight lines. The bank had sent another letter yesterday. It sat unopened on the kitchen table, but he didn't need to break the seal to know what it said. The red, stamp-screaming final notice was large enough to read from across the room. They wanted their money. They wanted the land if he couldn't give it. The idea of selling this farm made his chest tighten like he was being squeezed from the inside. His grandfather had bought this soil with the first real earnings he'd ever made. His father had nurtured it through storms and droughts alike. This land held the footsteps and sweat of men who had refused to let their stories be erased from the world. Mark was supposed to continue that lineage. He had promised he would. But promises didn't matter much to bankers. At noon, he stopped for a short break, sitting in the shade beside the tractor. He took a sip from his water jug, warm, metallic tasting, and wiped the grime from his forehead with the back of his arm. The world looked hazy beyond the shimmering heat. The only movement was the wind pushing dust from one dead corner of earth to another. He felt the weight of loneliness settle across his shoulders. There was no one left to share the burden. His mother was gone. His father, too. The woman he once married had grown tired of watching life drain out of him and this place. She left years ago for a town where the lights didn't flicker and the ground didn't betray you with every season. Mark sometimes wondered if she had been right to leave. He wondered what life he could offer anyone here. Afternoon drifted by in a blur of exhaustion. Mark's body moved on automatic, his mind drifting to memories he both cherished and feared to remember. He saw his father's hands guiding the plow, strong and steady. He heard his grandfather singing low while tending the cattle. Those ghosts kept him working even when hope was a thin thread stretched to breaking. The wind changed late in the day. It came in sharp gusts that whipped the dust into spirals. Dark shapes gathered near the horizon, clouds swelling in a rare display of promise. Thunder murmured in the distance, a deep and rolling sound that stirred something buried in the ground beneath him. Mark straightened slowly, unable to look away. He had stopped trusting forecasts, but storms were real only when they arrived. This one was coming. The sky continued to darken, blue fading into bruised violet. Birds darted across the fields in frantic patterns. The air grew heavy and charged with electricity as though the earth itself held its breath. Mark felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt for a long time. Anticipation. If rain finally came, not the light mocking drizzle, but real rain, it could soak into the soil, breathe life into it, maybe save even one field. He tried not to let the flame of hope rise too quickly. It had burned him before. He rushed to secure what he could, closing barn doors, covering the sacks of feed left outside, checking the shutters on the house. The wind howled like a beast finally set free, rattling windows and tearing at weak boards. Lightning split across the sky, illuminating the land in harsh flashes that showed every imperfection with startling clarity. Mark stood for a moment under the porch roof, watching the storm mass over the hills like an advancing army. Then the sky broke open. Rain crashed down with a force that felt almost violent. It hammered the ground, turning dust into slick mud within seconds. The roof groaned under the onslaught. Water spilled from clogged gutters. Mark stepped back, heart pounding. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen rain like this. The earth desperately needed it, but storms could be cruel while pretending to give. The night filled with noise. Thunder cracked over the farm like artillery fire. The wind pushed against the house, making its old frame shudder. Mark remained near the door for a long time, unable to tear his eyes away from the chaos outside. Was this too much? Would the weakened structures survive? Would the soil, after all its thirst, finally accept the water or reject it once again? Hours dragged by, and exhaustion finally forced him inside. He lit a lantern when the power flickered out, placing it on the table where the bank letters still lay unopened. The flame cast shifting shadows across the room, making the familiar walls look stranger, as though the house itself was nervous about what the storm might reveal or destroy. Mark sank into his chair, every muscle trembling. He listened to the rain pounding the roof overhead. It should have sounded like hope. Instead, it sounded like a clock ticking down. He worried that the earth beneath his feet was weakening, softening too much. When structures broke, they didn't always announce themselves first. Sometimes they simply dropped away. Sleep refused to come. Mark's thoughts circled endlessly, fear and hope colliding until he couldn't tell one from the other. Hours later, when the lightning finally softened and the thunder rolled farther away, the silence did not bring peace. It brought tension. Something had shifted out there. He could feel it in the bones of the house and in his own. He closed his eyes not to rest, but because he could no longer watch the storm's wrath. The farm had endured worse, he told himself, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He sat in the dim lantern light, shoulders slumped, breathing shallow. The night felt longer than any before it. Somewhere outside, beyond the walls that had sheltered generations, the ground moved. The storm had not simply passed through, it had left its mark, and not one mark could yet see. When morning came, he would learn what the darkness had been hiding, and that knowledge would change everything. Morning did not come gently. It pried the night away with a thick, gray light that looked tired before it even reached the earth. Mark Hudson rose from the kitchen chair, where he had finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. His coffee cup still sat on the table, cold and half full, next to the envelope stamped with the bank's demand. The lantern's flame had long since gone out, leaving only the bleak daylight to soften the shadows in the room. His stomach tightened with dread as he stood. The silence outside felt wrong. After such a violent storm, the world should be dripping, creaking, gurgling back to life. Instead, everything was still, as if the storm had washed away not only the dust, but movement itself. Mark stepped toward the front door, hand running along the familiar grooves in the wall before gripping the handle. He eased the door open and stared out. The air smelled of wet dirt, heavy and metallic. The fields glistened with patches of water, but not enough. Already, much of the rain had disappeared into the cracked ground, leaving only the evidence of its passing along the fences and rooftops. The farm looked soaked yet thirsty, like a man given one sip of water after years in the desert. He stepped off the porch into mud that clung to his boots like thick clay. Each footprint filled instantly with pooling water, then slowly drained into the trembling earth. The sky was a dull, overcast blanket, muting the world into shades of gray. He walked slowly along the yard, inspecting what damage the night had wrought. The barn roof sagged in at least 2 places, heavy from rain that had soaked through rotten wood. A piece of siding had broken loose and hung by a single bent nail, scraping softly against the wall with each weak gust of wind. Mark ran a hand down his face. Repairs would be necessary, and soon. But he pushed the thought away, one problem at a time. His heart still beat too fast from the memory of thunder shakes and lightning flashes that seemed too close for comfort. Now he wanted only certainty, concrete knowledge of where he stood. He headed towards the far corner of the property, where the storm's torrent had turned the dry pasture into a temporary river. Small branches had snapped off from the lone oak that still stood on his land, scattered like bones around its base. The earth was soft, too soft for a place that had been hardened by drought for years. It shifted under his steps with a subtle suctioning sound, as if the ground itself had become untrustworthy. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like a darker patch of earth, a shadow lying wrong against the land's contours. But as he moved closer, his pace slowed, his breath caught. The shape widened, deepened, no longer a shadow but an opening. A gash in the ground. A wound. It was a massive sinkhole. The soil collapsed into a jagged mouth that yawned wide enough to swallow a truck. The slope of the earth descended sharply into darkness. The edges were raw, torn by the storm's furious force. Loose dirt continued to crumble and slide inward as Mark approached, forming soft avalanches that vanished silently below. His pulse thudded in his ears. If the ground could give way like this here, what about beneath the house, beneath the barn, beneath his feet right now? He crouched cautiously near the rim, balancing his weight away from the softer edges, and peered down. The pit's walls were steep, coated in slick mud and exposed rock. At the bottom, if there was a bottom that he could see, shadows pooled thick and black, hiding whatever lay beneath. The farm had been dying piece by piece before, but this, the earth itself collapsing, felt like a final betrayal. A chill crept up his spine that had little to do with the cool morning air. Mark stood again, stepping back with deliberate care. He surveyed the distance between the sinkhole and the house. Too close. Far too close. If this expanded even a little, it could take out the storage shed. A little more, and the foundation of his home might crack and crumble. For the first time since childhood, Mark felt afraid of the land that had raised him. But fear couldn't be allowed to make the decisions. He needed answers, and he needed to understand what he was facing. He circled the sinkhole slowly, mapping the area with his eyes. He noticed how water still trickled down its walls, drawn by gravity into the unseen depths below. The storm had opened something, uncovered something that had been hidden beneath dry soil. He swallowed hard, knowing what he had to do next, even before the thought fully formed. If he didn't investigate this now, the unknown would only grow more dangerous. He walked back to the barn, boots sinking deeply with each step, and found an old coil of rope hanging from a nail. The rope was dusty and frayed in places, but thick and dependable. His father had used it years ago for hauling equipment and repairing fences. It had weathered more storms than Mark could count. He tied its end securely to the base of a sturdy fence post, rooted far enough from the collapse that the ground still felt firm. He tested the knot twice, tugging hard, ensuring it would hold. Then he returned to the edge and took a deep breath. His heart climbed into his throat. He gripped the rope tightly, boots angled to brace against the slope, and lowered himself slowly into the sinkhole. Every inch down was a negotiation between courage and caution. Mud slipped beneath his feet, sending rattles of debris skittering past him into the shadows. Cold air rose from below, chilling the sweat already forming on his neck. The world narrowed to the feel of rope against his palms and the sound of his own tense breathing. The further he descended, the more the sky above shrank into a distant patch of gray. Halfway down, his boot found a firmer rock ledge embedded in the wall. He paused, letting the rope rest slack for a moment while he scanned the dim surroundings. The sinkhole wasn't simply loose earth. The exposed rock looked old, layered, carved by forces deeper than roots or weather. It bore rough grooves, places where stone had fractured long before the storm arrived. This collapse may have revealed something long sleeping under the farm. When he reached the bottom, his boot sank slightly into wet soil but found enough purchase to stand. The pit was deeper than he'd estimated from above. The walls rose around him like a cracked dome, enclosing him in a cavern of damp earth and echoing silence. The sound of water dripping was steady, rhythmic, as if this place had its own slow heartbeat. He lifted his flashlight and swung the beam across the rocks. Mud glistened, reflecting the faint light in liquid shimmers. There were no animal bones, no remnants of old wells, nothing to suggest this had ever been touched by human hands. It was a place newly born into the open air. Then he heard it. A faint hiss, like breath passing through the clenched teeth. He followed the sound toward a jagged seam in the wall where water beaded and fell in tiny droplets. At first, it looked like nothing more than runoff from last night's drenching rain. But as he watched, he realized the flow didn't weaken or slow. It was steady, unwavering, not just leftover storm water. He crouched closer, brushing away loose mud to widen the view. And there it was, a thin, pure thread of water streaming from the rock itself. He reached out a calloused hand and let the droplets collect in his palm. The water was ice cold, startling against his skin. He brought it to his lips and tasted it. It tasted clean. Not metallic like rain soaked through rusted gutters. Not dirty or gritty like water pooled from the fields. Clean. Mark stared at the tiny stream, mesmerized. If this was truly groundwater, real, natural, constant groundwater, then this sinkhole wasn't a disaster. It was an opportunity, maybe even salvation. His heartbeat quickened for a different reason now, pounding with a cautious kind of hope he hadn't felt in years. If there was water under this land, real water, everything could change. Fields could grow again, debt could be repaid, the farm could live. But with hope came doubt like a shadow. What if this was temporary? What if the flow slowed once the storm's effects faded? What if he tried to invest again, only to watch everything collapse once more? His life had become a history of nearly rescued dreams that died anyway. The water dripped into the small puddle forming at the base of the wall. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop sounded like a ticking clock, a reminder that he didn't have the luxury to wait forever. The bank wouldn't. The land wouldn't. His heart wouldn't. He slowly stood again, gripping the rope as he looked upward. Clouds passed across the sky, darkening and lightening the hole in a shifting pattern of shadow. He needed to think. He needed information. He needed certainty before risking everything he had left. But first, he needed to get out of here alive. The climb back up was harder than the descent. Mud slicked his boots, sliding them away from the footholds he relied on. His hands cramped around the rope, fingers worn but determined. The earth crumbled beneath him more than once, sending small showers of pebbles bouncing past his legs into the pit below. His breath grew sharp and shallow, but he refused to look down. When his fingers finally caught the edge, he hauled himself over with a grunt, chest heaving as he sprawled on the wet grass near the rim. For a moment, he remained there, staring at the clouded sky, feeling the tremor still lingering in his legs. The land around him looked strangely unchanged, as if it didn't know it was hiding a heart of running water deep within. He pushed himself up, wiping his muddy hands onto his jeans. The sinkhole yawned behind him, vast and silent once more. He took a cautious step back. Then another. He couldn't fill it. He couldn't ignore it. But for now, he had seen enough. Everything depended on what he would do next, and he understood exactly how high the stakes had become. As he walked back toward the house, his steps were slow but steady. The farm looked the same as it had this morning, broken, weary, nearly lost. But Mark Hudson had seen something the storm had revealed in secret, something alive beneath the ruin. For the first time in a very long while, he allowed one dangerous thought to take root. Maybe this land was not done giving. The rest of that morning passed in a haze of conflicted thoughts. Mark paced slowly around the yard, glancing repeatedly toward the sinkhole as though expecting it to deepen or shift again. His boots squelched through damp soil, leaving deep, messy tracks that disappeared as the mud tried to reclaim them. The gray sky offered no comfort. It seemed to look down on him with indifference, neither granting hope nor denying fear, just watching as he wrestled with the consequences of what he had seen beneath the ground. He couldn't get the sound of that steady dripping out of his head. Drip, drip, drip. It echoed like a heartbeat, a reminder that somewhere deep in the earth a lifeline existed. A thin thread of water had traveled through rock and darkness for longer than he'd been alive, waiting for its moment to surface, waiting for something to awaken it. Perhaps the storm had only peeled away what time had buried, exposing the possibility of renewal. But possibilities came with costs. By midday, the sun broke through the cloud bank just enough to bring warmth back to the air. Steam rose from puddles, twisting into gentle swirls that drifted upward until they vanished. The storm's power seemed like a distant memory already, yet its impact remained carved into the land like a warning. Nothing had collapsed further, but Mark didn't trust that would hold forever. He fetched an old wooden pallet from near the barn and dragged it to the edge of the sinkhole, placing it as a kind of marker, less to warn others than to remind himself that danger hid beneath the grass. Back in the house, he washed the mud from his hands and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. It was still bitter, still thin, but this time he didn't notice the taste. He sat down at the table, staring again at the unopened bank letter. He forced himself to break the seal. The words inside were precisely what he had expected. Final demands, threats of foreclosure, deadlines closing in. The print was cold, impersonal, his entire world reduced to numbers on a page. He pushed the letter aside and rubbed his forehead with his fingertips. He forced himself to breathe slowly, not letting panic take over. Panic had never solved a thing. Hard work might. But even hard work needed tools, and the most important tool for a farmer was water. Without it, no amount of determination or sweat could feed a single seed. He picked up his phone. The screen was cracked at the corner, spiderwebbing out into a pattern that reminded him too much of the sinkhole. He scrolled through his contact list, searching for a number he hadn't dialed in years, a name attached to a memory of a conversation long past. When the display finally found the entry, Carter, Drilling and Ground Services, his thumb hovered uncertainly above the call button. It felt like a gamble he couldn't afford. Bringing in specialists would cost money he did not have, but doing nothing would certainly cost him everything soon enough. The clock was ticking, not just on his debts, but on the soil itself. This land didn't have many seasons left in it without water. He closed his eyes and exhaled through his teeth. Then he pressed the button. The call connected after a few rings. A receptionist's voice answered, polite but businesslike. Mark explained the situation as calmly as he could, careful not to sound desperate. He described the sinkhole, the exposed rock, the steady stream of water that showed no sign of slowing. The receptionist put him on hold briefly. Waiting in silence felt like standing at the edge of the pit again, staring into the unknown. When the line clicked back, the voice told him a team could come out within the week. There would be a base cost just for the survey, plus additional charges depending on what the investigation revealed. The numbers she quoted sent a flicker of dread through his chest, but under it was a stirring of determination. He thanked her and accepted the appointment. When he hung up, his hand lingered on the phone as though it might snap away and escape the consequences of the call. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. He was stepping into debt so deep it could drown him, unless the water beneath his feet saved him first. For the next few days, Mark waited. He inspected the sinkhole every morning and again each evening. He watched the stream of water flow steady and constant, carving a tiny channel into the mud below. It never faltered, no matter how dry the air grew after the storm. Sometimes he touched the rock around it, feeling how cold it remained even under full sunlight. Sometimes he crouched there for long minutes, imagining that the sound of the water was speaking to him, promising something, urging him to trust. But trust did not come naturally anymore. Too many promises had broken over the years. Promises from the bank, promises from the market, promises he made to himself when he believed hard work alone could save everything. In the evenings, when exhaustion left him little energy to work but too much anxiety to sleep, he would sit on the porch and stare out at the fields. The moonlight revealed every flaw, every crack in the soil, every dying stalk. Those fields had once fed dozens of families in the region. Now they barely produced enough to feed Mark. He rested his forearms on his knees and let out a slow breath. If the water below truly existed in abundance, he wouldn't just revive his own farm. He could help revive the entire community. On the 5th day, the Carter drilling truck rumbled up the dirt road in a spray of dust. 2 men stepped out, one older with silver at his temples and one younger, carrying a tablet and a bundle of cables. Both shook Mark's hand and asked to see the site. He led them across the yard, feeling strangely self-conscious about the state of his property. Old habits never died. Farmers always wanted others to see their land at its best, even when that best was long gone. The specialists examined the sinkhole with a practiced caution. They measured depths, checked the stability of the surrounding soil, and lowered instruments into the darkness to gauge moisture levels and rock composition. They spoke to each other in shorthand technical language that Mark didn't fully understand, but the tone of their voices was focused, not dismissive. That alone calmed a portion of the storm raging in his chest. The younger technician confirmed what Mark had suspected. This was not just a temporary flood pocket left over from the storm. Their instruments indicated consistent groundwater pressure. The stream could indeed be the visible sign of a hidden aquifer. The older man stood with his hands on his hips, studying the surrounding land, then turned to Mark with a measured expression. There was potential here, he said, real potential. Drilling a proper well could unlock a steady supply of water, but the process wouldn't be simple. It would require precision, equipment, and, inevitably, money. Mark nodded. He felt that familiar fear again, cold and sharp in his gut. The older man must have noticed the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He spoke more gently then, saying that risk was part of every great undertaking. Water was a treasure in this region. If Mark's land truly sat above a viable aquifer, he had something most farmers in the county would give anything to possess. The men promised to send a full report and cost estimate within a few days. When they left, Mark stood for a long while watching the dust of their departure settle back onto the road. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something vast, an opportunity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. That night, he spread the estimate papers across the kitchen table as though preparing for battle. The numbers stared back at him in stark black type. They were high, higher than anything he had ever committed to financially, higher than what a sane man would gamble when his farm was already hanging on by the weakest thread. But beneath the fear was that new seed of hope, fragile yet insistent. It whispered that miracles sometimes came from the most unlikely places. His father had taught him that progress often began when a person chose to keep going long after he had no strength left. He sat back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His eyes burned with fatigue and worry, but somewhere deep inside him, a fire rekindled, small but bright with defiance against defeat. He walked outside again, flashlight in hand, stopping at the edge of the sinkhole. The beam illuminated the bottom, where the small pool glimmered faintly. Mark watched the water flow, unbothered by the darkness surrounding it. Steady, certain, persisting even when no one saw it. It was enough. He looked up at the quiet night sky and nodded once to himself. The decision had already been made days ago. In the moment he first tasted that cold water and felt it promise him a second chance. Signing a contract would only make it official. He would drill the well. He would gamble every last cent he had, every drop of faith remaining in him. If this worked, the farm would not only survive, it would thrive. And if it failed, the farm would fall, but at least he would not spend the rest of his life wondering whether he gave up too soon. The land had given him a sign. He would not ignore it. With a steady breath, Mark turned away from the sinkhole and walked back toward the house, ready to bring the farm back to life or be buried beneath its loss. The night air felt different now, not gentler, not kinder, but charged, expectant. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning the drilling rig arrived, the farm seemed to come alive with a different kind of energy, an uneasy combination of anticipation and fear that thrummed beneath the damp soil. Mark Hudson stood on his porch while dust rose along the distant road announcing the approach of heavy machinery. The rising sun cut through lingering dew that clung to the grass, turning every blade into a tiny shard of glass. The air smelled of earth that had tasted water again and didn't want to let go. As the truck turned into his property, rattling the old fence posts, Mark felt his heart climb into his throat. This was it. No more wondering, no more pacing around the rim of the sinkhole like an uncertain sentinel. Today would begin a chain of events that could either resurrect his farm or bury it for good. 2 workers stepped out of the rig, followed by the same silver-haired specialist who had inspected the land earlier. They exchanged greetings, but Mark barely heard their words over the pounding in his ears. His truck, his barn, his house, they were all battered, tired survivors of too many years without hope. Now, these strangers were here to decide whether this land still had a pulse of its own. The sinkhole had been carefully fortified with temporary barriers to keep the machinery away from the unstable edges. The drillers set their equipment a safe distance from the pit, on a patch of ground that the older specialist had deemed structurally sound. Mark hovered nearby, trying to comprehend every step of the process, as the men unfolded steel pipes, arranged cables, and prepared the towering drill rig. The machinery's metallic clangs and the barked instructions between workers seemed to echo off the quiet fields like the first shouts of a battle beginning. Before long, the drill bit met the earth. The sound was harsh and relentless, vibrating through the ground into Mark's boots. He folded his arms over his chest and watched the soil eject in bursts of dust and wet clumps as the drill bit chewed its way downward. The sky had cleared completely, and sunlight bore down on them, but Mark hardly noticed the heat. His gaze was fixed on the machine, biting into layers of earth untouched by human hands for centuries. The hours stretched forward with a slow, grinding rhythm. Each moment felt like waiting for a verdict. When the drill hit rock, the sound changed, higher-pitched, more aggressive. The workers adjusted the machine, and it pushed on. They hit another layer of rock. And another. The process was frustrating, nerve-wracking. Mark imagined the drill bit snapping, the machinery failing, the workers packing up and leaving him with nothing but a deeper hole and a heavier debt. He forced himself to breathe. His father would have laughed in the face of such fear, would have placed a hand on Mark's shoulder and told him that nothing worth having came easy. But his father wasn't here now. Only Mark's doubt and hope battled it out in silence while the drill carved its path. By midday, they were deeper into the earth than the bottom of the sinkhole itself. The silver-haired specialist periodically checked the displays on his instruments, nodding subtly but offering no commentary. Mark paced back and forth, kicking stones, wiping sweat from his brow. He wanted time to speed up and slow down simultaneously, anything to relieve the awful suspense. The drill chugged, groaned, then suddenly stuttered. The workers shouted over the noise, adjusting levers and gauges. The machine shivered as though struck by something unseen below the surface. Mark's heart clenched. Had they hit another impenetrable rock bed? Was this the moment everything unraveled? Then came a sound unlike the others. A hollow bang followed by a long hiss. The drillers snapped to alert attention. One leaned over the equipment, checking pressure levels. He turned toward Mark with a single word that sounded like a prayer. "Stand back." Mark stumbled a few steps away, eyes wide. The machine whined as the drill bit broke through into some void below. A moment later, muddy water surged upward from the casing pipe, spraying out in a gushing stream. It mixed with dirt at first, dark and chaotic, but it was water. Water from the deep. Mark stood transfixed as the flow increased, the mud clearing little by little until what shot up from underground turned lighter, almost translucent. The drillers cheered. The specialist allowed himself the smallest of smiles. But Mark didn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, his chest rising and falling in disbelief. His throat tightened, and he had to blink rapidly as though the sunlight had grown too bright. It was real. A pressure so strong that even the machine trembled from its force. A source so clean that the ground itself looked brighter where the water splashed. The workers redirected the flow into temporary containment channels so they could test it. Mark knelt, cupping his hands once again under the stream. When he tasted the water this time, it tasted like an answer. The specialist confirmed what his senses already told him. The aquifer was substantial. This wasn't a fleeting pocket of groundwater. This was a reservoir with the power to revive crops, feed livestock, and sustain farms far beyond Mark's fences. It was more than a lifeline. It was prosperity buried under neglect. The drillers spent hours securing the casing, sealing it properly, installing a temporary pump. Mark hovered near every move, absorbing details like a man learning to breathe again. When the pump roared to life and water surged through the first pipe, It was as though the farm itself exhaled. He could see the change starting immediately. Soil that had been dead and dusty only a week ago now darkened beneath the spray of life. Small pools formed, spreading slowly into thirsty cracks. The scent of wet earth rose upward, thick and primal. It reminded Mark of his childhood before the droughts and debt. He could almost hear his father calling from across a thriving field, laughter in his voice, pride in his stride. When the work finally paused and the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of lavender and tangerine, the drilling crew cleaned their tools and loaded the rig. They gave Mark final instructions, promising to return soon to install a permanent system. He shook their hands firmly, gratitude too large for words. As their truck rumbled away, Mark stood alone beside the new water source. The evening breeze cooled his sweat, but inside, warmth spread through him like fire catching dry tinder. He looked across his land, not with dread, but with certainty. He could rebuild the irrigation lines. He could plant fully again, not just token rows to stave off hopelessness. He could repair the barn, bring in new livestock, restore the fields to what they once were. And beyond the fences, he knew the neighboring farms were dying just like his had been. They needed water. And he had it. The darkness settled around him gently, no longer heavy with despair. He lingered for a long time, listening to the water's continuous rush, a steady, persistent reminder that second chances weren't always miracles. Sometimes they were earned through stubbornness, pain, and an unwillingness to let go when the world told you to quit. Still, late that night, lying in bed, Mark's mind refused to quiet. The water had saved his farm, but news traveled fast in small towns, especially when something valuable surfaced. He imagined rumors spreading. People would want to know what he had found. Not all visitors came with good intentions. He had traded one set of problems for another. Yet, these new problems, he could face them. Because now, when he looked out across the barren fields in the moonlit dark, he didn't see defeat. He saw a future taking root. He closed his eyes finally, exhaustion pulling him downward. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was the faint pulse of the pump working outside, steady as a heartbeat. The land that had once turned against him was waking again, and he, weary but hopeful, was ready to rise with it. Dawn arrived quietly, slipping over the horizon in a soft wash of pastel orange and silver blue. Mark stepped out onto his porch with his first real sense of anticipation in years. The rhythmic hum of the temporary pump filled the morning air like a promise kept. For the first time, he didn't dread stepping outside. He didn't linger inside the doorway wondering what new disaster might be waiting. Now, the land itself invited him forward, asking to be touched, worked, revived. He could smell change on the air, damp earth, cool and alive, no longer brittle and defeated. Down by the irrigation lines, he watched the water flow freely into channels that cut through sections of soil he had almost given up on. The ground near the sinkhole, once dry and cracked, now glimmered dark and rich. Yesterday, he had run through the routine tasks almost in disbelief, moving pipes and clearing shallow trenches, his boots sinking into soft mud with every step. This morning, the sight greeted him like proof that yesterday had not been some fragile dream. His fingertips still remembered the cold rush of the water he'd held, and his heart beat with renewed certainty. It was working. He spent the morning moving the flow from one area to the next, careful to avoid letting any field go without drinking its share. He kept pausing, expecting that maybe the water would suddenly stop or slow or trickle away to nothing. But it didn't. It kept coming. His farm was thirsty enough to swallow every drop, but even that unending hunger couldn't diminish the sheer volume now available. Mark found himself smiling under his breath, an instinct that felt rusty but good. By midday, dust rising on the road caught his attention. He lifted his head and narrowed his eyes against the sun. The silhouette of a familiar pickup truck approached through the distance, tires kicking up thin clouds of pale dirt as it bounced along the old ruts. As it neared, Mark recognized the dented hood and faded blue paint. It was his neighbor, Richard Lane. Richard once ran one of the most prosperous farms in the county. His property stretched wide and flat beyond the western hills, land that his father and grandfather had carved into fields of golden wheat and sun-rich produce. But drought didn't worry about lineage. It had stripped his livelihood bare just as ruthlessly as it had destroyed Mark's. Over the past few years, Richard had lost livestock, equipment, and hope, each piece slipping away one season at a time. Now, his truck rattled and groaned like it carried more sorrow than metal. Richard stepped out with a tired nod. His shirt had been washed thin from use, and his face looked older than the last time Mark had seen him. They spoke quietly at first, the awkwardness of long struggle hanging between them like a third presence. But Richard didn't come for small talk. He came for water. Mark didn't need a long explanation. He had seen that look in his own reflection too many times, the kind that said everything hurt, but there was one more battle worth fighting if only a man had the means to fight it. Richard asked cautiously if Mark might spare a few barrels just to keep his remaining cattle alive. He said it quickly, eyes lowered, braced for rejection or resentment. But Mark's answer came without hesitation. Yes, of course yes. As they worked together to fill Richard's old water tank, news soon traveled, just as Mark had expected it would. That afternoon, 2 more trucks came down his road. By evening, 4. Some neighbors came with buckets and excuses ready on their lips, embarrassed to ask for help. Others arrived quietly with downcast gazes, their gratitude heavy and unspoken. Mark saw in all of them the reflection of a man who had been pushed to the very edge and still clung to the ledge with raw fingers. That night, when the last truck disappeared into the long stretch of county road, Mark sat again on the porch of his house. He watched the moonlight glint off the narrow channels he had dug. The hum of the pump settled into his bones like a steady heartbeat. Relief flooded him, strong and deep, but with it came a weight, a responsibility he hadn't yet acknowledged. The water was not his alone anymore. It belonged to more than one farm, more than one family, more than one history. It pulsed beneath the earth for everyone, not just him. He had fought to save his land, but now other people's hopes were tied to that same flow. As he took another sip of his now cool coffee, he realized what that meant. It wasn't enough merely to share what he could spare. He needed something sustainable, something that would last beyond his own capacity for generosity. Water, this kind of water, had power not just to nourish crops, but futures. He lay awake that night thinking about what needed to happen next. He saw, in his mind's eye, rows of farms blooming again with wheat and corn and fresh green shoots of promise. He saw barns being repaired. He saw children returning to houses their parents refused to abandon. He saw life. But he also saw the fragile line between resource and ruin. Because if he mishandled the gift beneath his land, if he let the wrong people near it, the water could be stolen, controlled, sold off to corporations who cared nothing for local soil or family roots. He knew stories of powerful companies eyeing the region for years, waiting for small farmers to break so they could sweep in and convert the countryside into another industrial zone. A water source like this was a beacon that could draw greed from far beyond the county lines. He needed a plan, not just to save their farms, but to protect their future. The next morning, Mark drove into town. The road was familiar but felt different now. He didn't drive like a man racing time. He drove like a man carrying purpose in the passenger seat. At the hardware store, he picked up supplies to expand the irrigation further. On his way out, he noticed how the town looked a little less abandoned than it had a week ago. People were still weary, but he caught glimmers of hope. Later, he met with a few farmers, those who had come first for water. They sat around a dusty table in an old community hall. Its windows rattled each time a truck passed, and the ceiling fans spun lazily above them, barely cutting the heat. But the men sitting at that table listened intently as Mark explained what he believed needed to come next. They would form a cooperative. Every farmer who benefited from the water would contribute to maintaining the infrastructure that delivered it. Decisions would be shared. Access would be fair. No man would be left out simply because he lacked money but possessed pride. And no outside force, no corporation with lawyers and checkbooks would ever gain control. The initial reaction was silence. Then, relief so heavy it made some men close their eyes, pressing their palms flat on the table as though grounding themselves against a surge of belief that had been too dangerous to hold before. A few murmured their agreement. Others nodded stiffly, trying to hide the tremble in their hands. Mark felt his shoulders relax, not because the work was finished, but because he finally wasn't walking this road alone. Over the following weeks, the transformation began. The cooperative installed additional piping, connecting neighboring farms. Storage tanks rose near barns that had nearly collapsed from emptiness just months earlier. Fields once left to wither were tilled and seeded again. Farmers who had stopped making plans for next year now talked about crop rotations. Children ran through patches of grass that hadn't seen green in far too long. Mark found his days filled with tasks he hadn't dared imagine a short time ago, checking pipes for leaks, inspecting soil moisture, coordinating with neighbors who now looked at him not with quiet pity, but with respect. He didn't want admiration, but he couldn't ignore the feeling of belonging that came with being relied on again. He no longer walked the land as a man expecting loss. Now he moved with purpose, with dignity restored in every stride. And he could feel the land responding to him. Birds had returned to perch on the fences, their chirping high and hopeful. Wildflowers sprouted where mud had once hardened into cracked plates. The creek at the edge of the property began to glimmer with runoff it hadn't tasted in years. Sometimes, in the hushed moments just after sunset, Mark stood by the wellhead and listened to the steady pulse of water rushing through the pipes. The sound was not simply mechanical. It was a living thing, a testament to resilience and grace. He was no longer merely surviving. He was rebuilding. But not everything that came with these changes was comforting. Word spread further than the county. A pair of men in crisp white shirts had already parked near the edge of his property once, clipboard in hand, polished shoes sinking into soft dirt they didn't understand. They asked questions about volume and rights and distribution. Their polite smiles couldn't hide the hunger in their eyes. They represented an outside interest. Mark saw danger behind their neatly trimmed hair and expensive watches. He told them nothing. Not yet. Not ever, if he had anything to say about it. Still, their presence proved his worry. People with money and motives would come. They always did when something pure and powerful surfaced unexpectedly. The cooperative wasn't just an opportunity, it was a wall they needed to build strong and fast to protect what mattered. Late one evening, Mark walked to the edge of his revived fields. The moon lit the rows of newly sprouting green as if painting them with silver. His heart swelled. His father and grandfather had broken their backs to keep this land alive. Now, through him, it breathed again. He knelt, pressing his palm into the moist soil. It clung to his fingertips with a grateful weight. His voice came quiet, a rasp barely louder than the distant murmur of nighttime crickets. "We're not done yet," he whispered, and he meant every word. The first true summer after the well began to flow arrived with a quiet confidence, as if the season itself had decided to reward those who had survived long enough to see another chance unfold. The land around Mark Hudson's farm no longer looked like a battlefield of abandoned hopes. It was changing, not all at once, but steadily, in the careful way seeds push upward through soil, finding the sun after too much darkness. Rows of young corn swayed gently in the breeze. Grains that once refused to sprout now greened the fields like soft fabric laid across the earth. The creak of old windmills had been replaced by the mechanical hum of pumps and pipes that connected farms like lifelines, stitching them together into something whole again. Everywhere Mark looked, he saw signs that his belief, or stubborn refusal to give up, had started something larger than himself. Trucks moved up and down the dirt roads more frequently now, not in desperation, but in the steady rhythm of purpose. Neighbors waved more often. Their gestures were no longer empty politeness, but genuine greetings, carrying pride instead of weariness. The community that had once felt like scattered survivors now resembled its former self, united not by struggle alone, but by shared recovery. Word had reached the county offices, then further still. This part of Oregon, long written off as dying agricultural land, was now talked about with curiosity. At town meetings, officials mentioned potential investment opportunities and agricultural rebirth. Mark sat in the back of those meetings, arms crossed and jaw tight, listening in silence. Attention was both a blessing and a threat. Not all eyes looking their way wished for the valley to belong to those who had nursed it back to life. Still, the present moment was worth holding on to. Mark walked his fields each morning as the sun bled pink into the horizon, breathing air that tasted cleaner than it had in years. The animals seemed to sense the shift as well. Birds chattered brightly in the trees, and a family of deer had begun grazing near the water reservoir at dawn. He tried to ignore the rows of trucks that paused periodically on the road beyond his fence, outsiders taking photos through their windows, wheels rumbling quietly before speeding away. The cooperative continued to grow beyond anything he had first imagined. Farmers who had been on the verge of selling their land now invested in new seedlings and equipment. Some even hired back workers they had once tearfully laid off. Children played again on porches and in newly green fields, their shouts of laughter making something deep inside Mark unclench. He hadn't realized how much he missed that sound until it returned. One evening, after a long day spent walking lengths of irrigation pipe beneath a hot sun, Mark found himself sitting on the porch as fireflies began to flicker to life. The wooden boards beneath him felt warm. The air vibrated softly with the ongoing hum of pumps and the distant croak of frogs near the growing pond. He leaned back, stretching tired muscles, but instead of pain, he felt something close to satisfaction. It was the feeling of work not wasted. As he watched the hills darken, he noticed Richard Lane's familiar truck rolling toward his house. It stopped near the barn, and Richard stepped out carrying a bag of fresh produce, ripe tomatoes and onions his land had finally yielded again. He walked up the porch steps and handed the bag to Mark almost shyly, eyes glancing aside like a boy returning a borrowed toy. There was no need for thanks or explanations. The gesture was enough. The cooperative wasn't just a plan. They were living it every day in small acts like this. Later that week, the farmers gathered for a community barbecue on the wide-open field behind the Carter farm, a place once dry and hardened but now soft with grass. There were folding tables covered with dishes that had not been seen at gatherings for too long, hot cornbread, casseroles full of vegetables, bowls of fruit that tasted sweeter for the struggle to grow them. The children kicked a dirt-scarred soccer ball across a space now vibrant with laughter. The adults stood in clusters, sharing stories about renewed plans, new tractors, livestock purchases, repairs to barns they thought would collapse. Even the air seemed lighter with relief. But amid the joy, Mark noticed a conversation taking place on the edge of the crowd. Two sharply dressed men stood alongside a county official, pointing at the farms with a calculating expression. Their smiles were thin and precise. Their shoes were too clean for soil like this. Mark's shoulders tensed as he watched them shake hands and trade business cards. He knew the type. He had seen those same polished smiles near the Sinkhole weeks ago, before the cooperative had fully formed. Richard eventually joined him, following Mark's gaze. "They're already circling," Richard muttered under his breath. "Smell success from miles away." He spat into the dirt, the gesture sharp and dismissive. "But we're ready for them now. We're not alone anymore." Mark nodded slowly, though unease prickled under his skin. He trusted his neighbors, he truly did. But a predator didn't need to catch all its prey. Just one gap, one weak moment could unravel what they were building. The group moved on without approaching them, but Mark noted the direction they drove off in, toward town, where permits and laws could be twisted into future leverage. He would need to keep a close eye on that. Progress had its enemies, especially when profit stood in the balance. As summer deepened into its warmest days, Mark saw the fruits of their collective effort spread far beyond the agricultural fields. The small grocery store, once run by a widow with thinning shelves, now stocked fresh produce from local farms. The diner reopened a section of its dining room that had been closed. The school announced it would reopen its agricultural club. The town, long shrunk to a shell of its former self, now breathed again. Mark's personal transformation unfolded alongside the valleys. He gained weight again, strong muscle returning to arms that had nearly dried to bone. His eyes, once sunk into shadow from sleepless nights, now held a glimmer of something steady. Purpose. He repaired his porch steps, painted the house a fresh white, and fixed the sagging roof of his barn. These weren't just improvements, they were declarations. One late afternoon, as he mucked out the barn, a young couple pulled up to the gate. They explained they wanted to revive a small family farm just beyond the ridge and hoped to join the cooperative. Their enthusiasm, nervous but hopeful, reminded Mark of a time before the drought had carved fear into the heart of every farmer in the county. He walked them along the irrigation lines, explaining how everything worked. By the time they left, their relief was visible, as though their future had finally gained a foothold. Standing there afterward, staring out across fields awash in golden light, Mark realized that what had begun as a personal fight for survival had evolved into something far greater. He wasn't merely saving his farm, he was helping to preserve a way of life that had shaped generations, and that understanding filled him with a gratitude that was almost overwhelming. He reached down into the dirt beside him and scooped up a handful. It crumbled, rich and cool between his fingers, but he knew better than to believe challenges were gone entirely. Trouble still lurked in shadows: corporate interest, greed, drought that could return if the climate shifted again. And beneath the earth, the source of their salvation needed care. If they drew too much, too quickly, they could unbalance what nature had kept stable for ages. Responsibility was not a burden to set down. It was the cost of what they had been given. That night, Mark walked to the well. The sky spread open above him in a sweep of stars so bright and sharp it felt like the heavens were leaning closer to listen. The pump clicked and thumped beside him, working steadily. He leaned on the fence post and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The valley, quiet and sprawling before him, was not the same place he had stood 2 years earlier, with a heart full of dread and an unopened bank letter weighing like a stone in his pocket. He had changed, too. He thought of his father. He imagined what the old man would say if he could stand here now, seeing the crops rising, the community thriving, the water flowing as though it had always intended to return. Mark smiled faintly. He hoped his father would be proud that stubbornness and grit, battered but unbroken, had brought them to this moment. A cool breeze drifted up from the fields, and Mark breathed deeply, letting the scent of soil and water fill his lungs. He understood now what it meant when people said land could love. It was a partnership, a bond written not in contracts but in roots and footsteps and sweat. He felt connected to the ground beneath him more deeply than ever before. He turned back toward the farmhouse, lights glowing warm through the windows. He wasn't alone anymore. Not really. The valley was alive again, pulsing with heartbeats beyond his own. Children were growing, land was thriving, and the community was rising like crops in summer. There were still threats waiting, still voices eager to claim what they hadn't sown. But the valley had defenders now, people who understood that water wasn't just a resource, but a future worth fighting for. As Mark closed the gate behind him and walked toward his door, the pump continued to hum behind him, steady as faith. From the depths of the earth, the water kept flowing. It nourished wheat and people and hope, turning parched land into home again. The valley had once been dying. Now it was reborn. And so was he. If this story inspired you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe to join our community and tap the bell so you never miss the next story that could change everything. Share this video with someone who needs hope today, and keep watching. Your next favorite story is waiting.